Hello, and welcome back to Book and Page. Let's talk about the end of Frogs. So, that was sort of an interesting poetry competition. As always, let's do a brief summary of what happened in this very last part of Aristophanes' The Frogs. Then we'll talk about things in a little more depth. So we were in the middle of the competition, and the competition continues on. This time the focus is going to be on the prologues. So how the prologues work is Aeschylus recites prologues, Euripides decides something's wrong and points it out, and then they switch around so the other person can do the same. Once the prologues are finished, it's then on to the lyrics, the songs that are included. Oddly enough, though, for the lyrics, each person sings in a mockery of the other person, rather than allowing the person to recite the songs themselves. This doesn't seem to give them a clear answer, and it's finally decided, you know what, let's just go for the measuring of poetry. This is done by Dionysus using a set of weights, and basically each of them will hold on to one of the weighted pans and announce a piece of their poetry, a single line to be weighed against the other person. This is done a grand total of 3 times, with Aeschylus coming out on top every single time. Yikes. Doesn't seem to be some competition there. Ultimately, though, Dionysus says that he really can't decide. One seems very wise, but his heart wants the other one. Hades, or Pluto, as this translation is calling him, tells him that he'll have to make the decision anyways, and as a reward for doing so, he will be able to take his chosen playwright back up with him. Dionysus finds this very compelling and states that he actually came down to get the playwright for a reason. It turns out he wasn't just craving Euripides' work, he is concerned about the state of Athens. Most notably because for him, if Athens doesn't exist, he doesn't get the whole Dionysian festival with the drama. So, he says, since I am looking for advice for the city, why don't I see who has the better advice and take them? He asks 2 questions, which is to say, what should Athens do about Alcibiades, and how can the city be saved? Ultimately, well, we'll talk about the answers in a little more depth later. But we do get answers. Both seem to offer different types of advice, and Dionysus is still not sure what he wants to do. When pressed, though, Euripides actually points out that Dionysus swore he would take him, because they are good friends. Dionysus admits that while his tongue swore, he's going to choose Aeschylus instead anyways, an answer that upsets Euripides so much he has to be forcibly removed from the stage. Ultimately, the play ends when Aeschylus and Dionysus head off from Hades' house and back up to the world, after being given several ways for people to kill themselves at the request of Hades to give it to certain politicians. Yeah. When I was talking about the frogs, not the play, but the characters of the frogs, and the political turmoil that started there, and then ended up just expanding as the play went on, through the act of being Achilles and not being Achilles, and everyone changing their minds. You might have thought I was reading it too much into the political side of things. You hit this point and you realize, nope, the play is doing it that themselves. Yeah, that entire discussion I had about the changeliness of the Athenian people. But let's talk poetry first. Which is to say, I'm not going to be talking poetry and song critiquing. That is definitely not my area of expertise, if you can say I even have one of those. So I can't say whose poetry is better or worse. One of the things I do like to point out, though, is the fact that each playwright is allowed to speak his own prologues. When it comes to the songs, well, they end up making fun of each other and speaking the other's works. But the prologues are considered their own. Part of this might be that, as you see from the arguments, a lot of these songs that these playwrights use have some sort of basis already in existence within the culture. Would it be the types of tune they use, the types of lyrics they use, or the subject matter overall? We get references to sea shanties here as well, and hearing other people singing and then incorporating that. So that might explain why the songs aren't so particular to a person that they themselves need to recite it. The prologues, though, are easily and often critiqued, certainly, but each playwright does get to speak his own prologues. And something seems to be said here about, I don't want to say ownership, more the relationship between the writer and what is written. The songs aren't as personal, so they can be shared by everybody, and the styles can be changed and messed with and developed. The prologues, though, are very personal. Not evidently always well done, because we do get some critique here. Most notably, Aeschylus has a tendency to repeat himself, and Euripides has a tendency to stick so strongly to his style and beat of the prologue that you can very easily insert and losk his little flask of oil and somehow have it fit perfectly into the meter and rhythm of the prologue. Both of these are understandable critiques, which is to say that you shouldn't often be repeating yourself, especially that close together. It can occur on occasion, but you always have to be careful, because usually if you want to use the repeating method, it's to point out something really critical that you should be paying attention to. If this is the case, you can't use it that often, because then, well, it's not pointing to something critical, it's just being repetitive. For Euripides, you really do need to start changing up the style. Somebody will tell you very easily that one of the worst things to read is just 5-word sentences on repeat, never ending. You gotta make some variety, have short sentences, have long sentences. Learn the form and then get creative with it. And this is then when you start seeing the fact that Aeschylus is very clearly going to win. that might sound confusing, because it's not really clear even to Dionysus, he says, until the very end. But there is a difference between the craft and the art. This is one of those days where I don't trust my craft really well, which is to say I'm not sure I can choose my words well. What I'm trying to say here is Euripides knows his craft which is to say he can write a prologue with very clear rhythm and structure. That doesn't make it interesting. I know this isn't something you probably ever want to hear about your stuff, but you need to learn the rules so that you can break them. And people will tell you this, especially when it comes to grammar. You need to learn the rules first, so then you can figure out how you can break them properly. But breaking them is to be expected. If you just constantly stick with one format, well, it's gonna get really repetitive really quickly. Sometimes the key thing about art is going beyond the craft and medium and bringing something unexpected in. The fact that Euripides can constantly be interrupted with a little flask of oil, well, that says something about his art. The art isn't coming through, the craft is. And the craft is so strong that no one complains when you wreck it with the oil. You laugh instead. This is a comedic bit because, well, you're not sitting there going, you're gonna ruin everything if you do that. The moment it becomes obvious that the craft is there and not necessarily the art, well, that's where the comedy comes in. Aeschylus is winning this, strangely, from the beginning. Because all Euripides can point out is that Aeschylus has a tendency to repeat himself. Yeah, maybe Aeschylus could learn to, like, trim down some of the words, but he does defend himself by stating that he's actually using the words in different ways. He is referencing other things, even if he's not super clear about that. Especially if you already need to know the context, or a look inside the artist's head. Aeschylus is winning. This becomes very strange then when you compare it to the weighing of the poetry. Because then Aristophanes, as the writer here, really makes it clear about this. That is to say that, again, Euripides is going for the craft, while Aeschylus is going for the art. And the art is suiting what is happening. Aeschylus goes for the weight of lines that he feels are really well built. And then you find out somehow that this weighing actually is in reference to the physical weight of whatever is being spoken about. Like, what? Euripides loses the first round because he mentions winging away, which means something's very light because it's off flying, versus Aeschylus mentioning the ocean. Craft and form versus art and substance. It's strange, because it almost seems to be leaning towards the idea that Euripides might be better craft-wise, but Aeschylus has the substance. And even Dionysus sort of makes it obvious that this is a hard choice. Because he says one of them is very wise, but his heart wants the other. He is here to continue the drama festival. And that is craft. But ultimately, Dionysus has to choose the substance over the craft. Because the substance goes beyond. You see, knowing how to craft a good play is important for a playwright. Learning from the play good substance that can be applied to more than just the play. And that's what Dionysus ends up pointing towards. Okay, let's talk Alcibiades. Oh, this is one of those historic figures that you either tended to really like or really dislike. Okay, so he comes up in a variety of literature of the time. Here he is referenced in a play. He is also directly mentioned in several of Plato's dialogues, including one called Alcibiades, in which Socrates goes to Alcibiades and tries to convince him that Socrates would be the best lover for Alcibiades' beloved. Yes, Alcibiades is a very pretty young man with many admirers, including Socrates. Though Socrates in Alcibiades makes the argument that it's more about Alcibiades' soul, and inner beauty than purely external. But ultimately Alcibiades is a pretty looking young man who has money and stature and connections and doesn't always act properly. For example, in Plato's dialogue, oh man, that's terrible. The Symposium, which also actually features Aristophanes. It's a bunch of well-to-do Athenian citizens getting together for a party. Socrates is there, Aristophanes is there, and partway through, Alcibiades shows up announcing, "Good evening, gentlemen, I am plastered." He shows up drunk to the party. And this dialogue is actually set right before a critical historical event, which is to say that Athens is at war. It's kind of hard to figure out who they're at war with because they've been at war with the Persians before and they've been at war with the Spartans, and overall it's just a really uncomfortable one, and they're invading Sicily. And they send Alcibiades as a general to do this. But the night before Alcibiades takes off with the army, a bunch of Hermes statues are desecrated. Their penises are removed. And this is considered a really bad omen. But Alcibiades leaves the army anyways. Somehow it ends up being blamed on Alcibiades. He's told to come back. He says no. They try him in Absentina. Alcibiades says screw it and goes to the Spartans. Ultimately bounces between the Spartans and the Greeks for a while, and I think somehow towards the end of his life he ended up in Persia, but he wasn't really important past that point. Oh, yeah, no, you can see the problem that is Alcibiades. Just... And the advice we then get from our two playwrights leans into the political idea that we were getting earlier, which is people are really changeable and they want something and they don't want something and they want something and they don't want something, and they're not always critical thinking about this. Because that's exactly what Euripides says. Euripides like, throw him out. And this becomes really apparent that this is what's being gestured to with the second question, which is how to help Athens. And Euripides says, well, if things are going wrong now, just do the opposite, which is exactly the political system that screwed over a lot of good people, and ultimately in a lot of ways screwed over Athens because they got angry, kicked the good people out, made even more mistakes, had to bring the good people back, and at that point in time, probably a little too late. Aristophanes feels, it seems, like Euripides is a symptom of this political scheme, if not a cause. Not the cause, but an encourager towards this way of thinking. Well, Aeschylus offers the hard advice that's going to be better if listened to. And that is, if you create the problem, then you need to deal with it. When asked what Athens should do about Alcibiades, Euripides says, throw him out. He's not a real citizen. And Aeschylus says, if you have raised a lion cub, well, then you need to expect it to act like a lion. Athens did this to themselves from the very beginning of Alcibiades' young interactions with the world. Athens let him get away with shit and didn't respond properly. They raised him to be as he is today. Well, you can't expect the cheetah change its spots to mix up animal metaphors. Alcibiades isn't going to change his personality overnight because you guys are upset you let it get to this point. You helped build him. You're going to have to embrace him. Which is to say that Aeschylus is actually saying to keep Alcibiades. Learn from your mistakes, but also give Alcibiades the room he needs to maneuver as the lion that he is. And this is really hard, because this is then turning around and telling the people of Athens, you did this, you clean it up. You can't just throw it out. Clean it up. Fix it. Deal with it. Which is how we solve the political problem of just tending to toss everybody out when we're given a chance. But that's hard. You're asking every Athenian citizen who has the vote to think critically. And critically about a lot of things. What have you asked this person to do? What resources did you give them to do it? What outcome did you expect? How did you treat this person earlier with mistakes and, well, victories? Because all of those are going to affect how a person develops and continues to act in the position that you've given them. Athens hasn't been doing that. Athens has become so utterly greedy that they want everything immediately. And that's why Aeschylus' second piece of advice of how to save the city is to let go of a lot of things. Critically, to go to sea, which has saved Athens in the past, with the Persian invasion, if I have my history correct. Basically, the city of Athens itself was abandoned, all its citizens hopped onto boats, and survived at sea until the Persians had moved on. ultimately their navy is actually a strong point, and a lot of naval battles go to the Athenians. So the ability to cut themselves off from the land, to let go, and trust in their strengths is key. But this is an Athens that's moved past that. This is an Athens, at least in Aeschylus, or, well, Euripides, through the voice of Aeschylus, is recognizing, has become much more greedy in what it wants, and much more possessive of what it has. And he asked, well, have you been electing noble-minded people? Dionysus says, no, we tend to favor the opposite. Not because we have a choice, we kind of don't. Well, that's because the city and its government has gone downhill to the point where really the liars and cheats are the only ones capable of being in power. Because the city just wants and wants and wants, and the citizens want and want and want. That's part of the problem that created Alcibiades in the first place. So altogether, maybe Dionysus makes the right choice. Maybe we want the form. The form seems simple. The form is clear and concise, and often tells us what we want to hear. That's what Euripides is doing throughout this competition, telling us what we want to hear. It's the easy way. It's the fill-in-the-blank form, as it were. But it's the hard answers. It's the deeper content and the problematic need to think critically. That is what we need. One of them is wise, but our heart tends to cry out for the other one. A lot of us wish our problems would just magically disappear, that everyone would tell us things are okay. But sometimes, well, a lot of times, what we actually need is someone to turn around and say, you've made a mess of it. You made this choice and this choice and this choice. You have self-destructive behaviors, and you need to address them if you want to get anywhere in life. That's going to take a lot of hard work. It's going to take a lot of self-understanding, and it's going to really hurt to start. Because no one wants to admit that they can be their own worst enemy. Especially when you put that on a city scale. Dionysus makes the choice. He does what's right for the city. And ultimately maybe what's right for himself, even if it hurts a little bit. And even if it means he has to go back on his word. That is really uncomfortable. You figure the right thing to do shouldn't mean that somehow morally you've moved away from your morals. I think the right thing should do, well, there's always going to be the truth to it. And you always swear to do the right thing, but sometimes you're misinformed. Dionysus learned his lesson. But Aristophanes, well, he finishes it with a twist of the knife. Quite literally. Aristophanes not only has pointed out that this is really hard, he also points out in the very last section with Hades' speech to the politicians, well, that changing might literally mean getting rid of the old guard. There's a reason the play ends with, here's a bunch of ways to kill yourself, do it now. That's uncomfortable. Let's take a look at another one of his plays. Next up, we will be looking at Aristophanes' The Wasps. It actually comes in the very same text of Frogs that I have, so good text to pick up. I'm going to get reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.